1933, there was a young German pastor. His name was Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And he was watching his country unravel. See, Adolf Hitler had just recently risen to power, and many German Christians decided that the safest thing to do was to stay quiet, to keep their heads down and hope that things would get better. But Dietrich Bonhoeffer couldn't do it because he saw the lies, he saw the hatred, he saw the twisting of the truth, and he refused to be silent. And he began to preach openly against the Nazi regime, warning the church that if it will not stand for truth, it would fall for anything. And he once wrote words that stand true today. He said, "Silence in the face of evil is itself evil. God will not hold us guiltless. Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act." Now those words cost him his freedom and ultimately his life. He could have kept quiet and survived, but he chose to speak up for what was right, no matter the cost. And that same spirit of courage, the willingness to speak when silence feels safer, is exactly what we see in the character of Esther. Now, she wasn't a preacher, she wasn't a prophet. She was a young woman caught between comfort and conviction. And she lived in a culture that didn't honor her faith. And when evil threatened God's people, the easiest thing she could have done was just stay quiet. But when the moment came, she stood up, she spoke out, and God used her courage to change the story for an entire nation. We're continuing in a series called The Art of Being Unordinary. And today we're going to look at the story of Esther. Now, some of you might be familiar with the story of Esther. How many of you know the story of Esther? Good. How many of you know it from the VeggieTales story of Esther? Okay. How many have never really heard about Esther? It's okay, raise your hand. That's okay. Awesome. Now here's the thing. I'm covering this story in some very broad strokes. I want to encourage you this week, or maybe even today, to read the story because it has lots of details that I can't cover today. I want you to see the whole thing verse by verse. But let me give you some context. So this is 100 years after the Jews have been taken in exile. Nebuchadnezzar came in, he conquered Jerusalem. He took those people off. That's where Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego, they were taken away, and Esther was taken just like them. This is 500 years before the birth of Christ. And this is the Persian Empire, the largest empire at the time, modern day Iran. And many of God's people were scattered around. They were living far away from Jerusalem, and they're trying to make sense of their life in this foreign culture. But there's something that's immediately fascinating about the book of Esther. If you can believe it, God's name is never mentioned in this book. Not once. There's no prayer recorded. There's no prophet speaking. There's no miracles being performed. But God's fingerprints are everywhere in this book. It's almost as if the writer is saying this: even when you can't see God, he is still working. Here's what's happening. King Ahasuerus, or Xerxes, the most powerful man in the land at the time, throws a huge party. This party lasts for days. And on the 7th day, he asks his queen, Queen Vashti, if she would parade her beauty in front of all of the drunken men at the party. Now, he says in the thing that she would come and show herself to these men wearing her crown. Most scholars believe what he meant was only wearing her crown. And she refuses. You know, she's smart. She says, no, I'm not going to do that. And this sets in motion the search for a new queen. Many women are brought, probably hundreds, and one young woman named Esther, who's a Jewish orphan and is being raised by her cousin Mordecai, comes with all of these women. And then they go through like 12 months of this sort of beautifying rituals, all kinds of things. But she was special because the Bible says that she was beautiful. She was smart, and as you will see, she was also very courageous. Let's go to Esther chapter 2 as we pick up our story. Verse 17. Actually, let's go back to verse 16. And when Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign, the king loved Esther more than all of the women. And she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. It's a strange story, this sort of series of strange coincidences, not all of them good. I mean, there's this drunken party, there's hundreds of women that are being displayed for the king's pleasure, and there's no words from God at this time, and not even any words about God. But here's what you should know, and if you're taking notes, I would suggest you write this down. In her life and in your life, God's silence does not equal God's absence. God's silence does not equal God's absence. God doesn't have to be mentioned for God to be moving. God doesn't have to be visible for God to be victorious. Even if the popular culture has written God off, God is still in control. Even when you can't hear him, he's still working. It reminds me of the line from that song, Waymaker. Even when I don't see it, you're working. And it's sort of a paradox because, listen to this, God might do some of his best work in silence. God does some of his best work when you don't understand what's happening. And only at the end do you see it. I was watching a YouTube video. Sometimes I go down these YouTube rabbit holes, and there's this like young girl, and she's a chess master. I don't know if you've ever seen any of these videos. And she'll go out to parks and play chess. And she was playing against one individual who I think was probably a pretty good chess player. And she's making these moves, and it's going real fast. You know, they have that little timer that tut, 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 tut. And he's talking, and he's not really paying attention, and I don't understand anything that's happening. And all of a sudden, one, boom, boom, checkmate. In the background, you have no idea what's happening. She's 8 moves ahead of him. Sometimes God's like that. That's what God's doing in Esther's story, and he's doing that in our stories too. He's moving kings and queens around. He's turning chance encounters into divine appointments. He's orchestrating conversations, opportunities, even delays, all to position his people for the right moment. So when you can't see his name on the page, or when you can't see his name on your page, when the situation in the Bible doesn't make sense, and when it doesn't make sense in your life, don't assume that God is losing ground. He's the author. He's still writing, and he's not finished with your story yet. So what's happening now? Well, there's a guy, his name is Haman. Now, he's a bad guy. He's one of the top officials. He becomes angry with Mordecai. That's Esther's cousin, essentially her sort of adopted dad, because Mordecai refused to bow down to Haman like everybody else. So Haman convinces the king to issue a decree to eradicate the Jews in the empire. Now, by the way, this is a major theme all throughout the Bible. It's like the plot of Satan to wipe out Jesus is to take the Jewish population away because he knows the Messiah is coming from the Jews. So Mordecai then sends word to Esther, and he says to her, hey, you can do something. The king likes you. You have an opportunity here. But there's a problem because in this culture, nobody can just show up and talk to the king. Now, I know it sounds weird for us because you're like, what are you talking about? If you want to go say something to somebody, you go talk to them. Not here. If you show up unsummoned, it could cost you your life. Let's go to Esther chapter 4, and we'll pick up the story. Look at verse 11. All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law, to be put to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter so that he may live. But as for me, this is Esther talking, I have not been called to come into the king these 30 days. So the king doesn't want to be bothered. There's a rule. If you come and bother him, you could die. And he hasn't called for Esther. So when Mordecai tells her, hey, you should go talk to the king, she's like, that's like giving me a death sentence. But this is her defining moment because Mordecai replies with this famous line. Let's pick it back up at verse 12. And they told Mordecai what Esther had said. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther. Do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent as this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. That's the heartbeat of this whole book. For such a time as this. Remember, Esther's life is not random. It's strategic. She's not in the palace because she's lucky. She's not even in the palace because she's beautiful. She's in the palace because that's where God called her to be. And the same is true for you. You're at your job for a reason. You're at your workplace for a purpose. You're at your school, either attending or teaching, for a reason. You're in your family for a reason. You and I, all of us, we live in this cultural moment, and there's something going on right now in this culture. We are living in this cultural moment on purpose right now, not 100 years ago and not 100 years from now. Remember, God doesn't make placement mistakes. He's like, oh, I should have put them 100 years earlier. Why does he put us in these places? Because he needs us to know something very simple. And you can write this down too. Courage is obedience at any cost. Courage is obedience at any cost. Sometimes when you speak up, it could cost you everything. Maybe even your life. I don't know if you remember this story, but about 10 years ago, there was 21 individuals that were captured. 20 of them were Egyptian Coptic Christians, and one was not a believer. And they were captured by ISIS, and they were brought after a period of time and sort of paraded. They were put on their knees in a line of people with these terrorists behind them with knives. And one by one, they asked the individuals, do you reject Christ? And one by one, each of the Christians said, I do not reject Christ. And one by one, they had their heads removed. And they got to the last individual who was not a believer. And they said, what about you? Do you reject Christ? And it's reported that he said, their God is my God. The power of speaking out. Now listen, we may never face a situation like that for our faith. But we will face moments where standing up for our faith has a cost. Maybe it's at your workplace and everybody's mocking something that you find holy, or they're mocking church, or they're making fun of Jesus, and you have an opportunity to speak up and say something, but you know that it will cost you something in your workplace. Or maybe you're in a relationship and that relationship is fading because you're not willing to compromise your values. And you speak up for your own purity and for God's rules on marriage and relationships. Maybe it's at a family dinner where the discussion comes up and your biblical conviction is not a popular one there. These are all modern day Esther moments. Now remember, it would have been easy for Esther to play it safe. She could have stayed quiet. She could have enjoyed her royal lifestyle. She could have kept her head down and hoped that someone else would fix the problem. But know this, silence in the face of opposition doesn't build faith. It suffocates it. So what happens next? Well, let's look at Esther chapter 4, verse 15, as the story continues. Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai. Go gather all the Jews to be found in Susa and hold a fast on my behalf, and do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. In the original Hebrew, it's a little bit more like, if I am destroyed, then I am destroyed. This is critical. Because before she attempts to go to the throne room uninvited, she decides to fast and pray about it. Think about this. Before she's going to stand before an earthly king, she kneels before the everlasting king. And that's where courage is born. Not in the throne room, but in the prayer room. When you're facing big challenges in your life, challenges that might cost you, the thing to remember is that you don't need more confidence in yourself. What you actually need is more dependence on God. We think in our culture that strength comes from personality, platform, or position, but that's not true. Our strength comes from his presence. And that's exactly what Esther is acknowledging. I know it seems weird, but in her culture, she's got no right to come before the king. She's not a dignitary. She's not a powerful ruler. She is the queen, but she's one of many, actually. He has hundreds of other queens. She's the main one, but she's just one of many. And what she lacked in Persian power, she made up for in godly courage. So let's go to Esther chapter 5 as we see how the story unfolds. On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace in front of the king's quarters, while the king was sitting on his royal throne inside the throne room opposite the entrance to the palace. And when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won favor in his sight. And he held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. And the king said to her, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given to you, even to half of my kingdom." So Esther walks into the throne room. I'm sure her heart was pounding, not knowing if the next few moments of her life would be her last. The king looks up, he sees her standing there, and instead of condemning her, he extends this golden scepter. He extends grace, he extends favor, he extends life. And he says, "What is it that you want? I'll give you whatever you want, up to half of my kingdom. Know this, when we step out in faith, that's when God steps up in power." After Esther risked her life before the king, now the story moves pretty fast actually. The king welcomes her, asks what she wants. Instead of blurting it out, she wisely invites the king and Haman to 2 banquets. And that night at the banquet, she responds to the king, "If I found favor in you, O king, spare my life and the lives of my people." Remember, Haman was trying to take out the Jews. And the king demands, well, who would dare threaten Esther? And Esther points at Haman and says, "This wicked man, Haman." And Haman is executed on the gallows that he actually built to kill Mordecai. Again, there's a lot more to that story. You should go read all of the details. And there's a new decree that allows the Jews to defend themselves. And instead of being destroyed, they experience deliverance. Mordecai is then promoted to second in command. And the people celebrate with a new feast called Purim, which is a yearly reminder that God saves his people even when his name seems hidden. And in the end, everything reverses. The plot of death becomes the story of life. The quiet faith of one woman changes the destiny of an entire nation. What a story. This forgotten Jewish girl becomes a queen. A hidden God becomes a hero. And what looked like coincidence turns out to be divine coordination. And Esther didn't just save her people. She reminded the world that even when God seems silent, he is never still. And maybe that's what we need to remember right now, because we live in a moment that feels a lot like Esther's world, where truth is negotiable, conviction is costly, and comfort is king. It's easier to stay quiet in our world, isn't it? It's easier to keep our head down, to keep our prayers private, and to keep our public speech about things relatively private. But God has not called his people to blend in. He's called us to stand up. He's called us to speak truth with grace. He's called us to conviction with compassion, and to represent Jesus faithfully even when it's uncomfortable. Now, your palace might not look like Esther's. Could be your workplace, could be your classroom, your neighborhood, could be your social media feed. But the assignment is the same. That's where God placed you. And you might say, well, I'm not bold enough. Well, neither was Esther. She was afraid, she was unsure. At some level, she was underqualified, but she made up for all of that by trusting God and receiving courage from him. So here's a question for you. What if you are exactly where you are in this culture, in this time, in this moment, because God's placed you there for such a time as this? What if these conversations that you dread are actually divine appointments? What if the pressure that you feel is actually preparation for the purpose that God's given you? What if your quiet, ordinary, faithful courage becomes the hinge that God uses to open up someone else's heart to him? Like all of these saints we're talking about in this series, God's not asking you to be powerful. He's asking you to be obedient. He's not looking for someone who's just qualified. He's looking for someone who's willing. Because when you take your stand, that's when God takes his place. So don't let silence steal your faith. Don't let fear dictate your obedience. Don't let comfort keep you from your calling. You were made for this moment. You were placed in this generation, and you were called for such a time as this. Let's pray. God, thank you so much.